Slide. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am Jenny Pelman-Robinson with the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution and co-chair of the Education Working Group along with Gael Simon. And we are absolutely delighted to be welcoming you here today for the Education Working Group session. As hopefully many of you know, a very warm welcome, as this is part of our 6th annual workshop of the Global Community of Practice on Scaling Development Outcomes. And we are sort of at the tail end of a very exciting 2 weeks that hopefully many of you have been able to participate in. I want to welcome back our members of the Community of Practice and the Education Working Group in particular. We are now more than the Community of Practice, more than 1,000 individuals representing more than 300 organizations. So certainly have grown tremendously over the past 6 years. And for those of you who aren't yet members of the working group or of the Community of Practice, please consider joining. A special welcome to you all and an open invitation from us to join. It's completely voluntary and free of charge. For those of you not familiar with the Community of Practice, just to say a brief word, it's dedicated to advancing and professionalizing the practice of scaling by learning across sectors, geographies, and perspectives. In addition to this annual workshop that we have, in the past it was in person, and hopefully we go back to that again. The Community of Practice also issues quarterly newsletter that we invite all members to contribute scaling resources and information and updates to. The Community of Practice operates 9 thematic working groups, education being one of them, where we investigate issues related to scaling from that particular lens. And each working group holds quarterly virtual webinars, as well as has a dedicated web page on the Community of Practice website. So we'll put the website and the email address in the chat box, and we encourage you to join. And certainly if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I'm going to turn it over to Gael in just a moment to introduce the panel and the topic for today's conversation. But just to start with a very brief overview and get a sense of who all is here with us in this virtual room, and just to remind you of what we've done as a working group over the past year. So just to begin, Natalie, if you would please start with that first survey. So just going to ask you all, if you could just please identify if you're a current member of the Education Working Group or not quite yet. In the past, I forgot, we actually had an unsure button, and that got a considerable number of responses. We might want to do that in the future. Fantastic. Okay. All right. So about 70%, about 2/3 working group members, and about 1/3 not yet. So we hope to see that line grow over the next year. And then in terms of just the next slide, I think it's just nice, given that we don't have the opportunity to all be sitting together in person, just to have a sense of where everyone comes from, just briefly, and just perhaps by the sector that you represent.
I'm not getting this.
Great. Okay, we're about evenly divided between NGOs, academia, private sector. No, NGOs certainly growing. Great to see our government partners also represented. I know that's been a group that's been growing steadily in the Community of Practice, and certainly funding institutions. Great. Really helpful to see. I appreciate. Thanks for taking the time to do that. Thanks, Natalie. Well, just to quickly recap over the past year, for those of you who have been involved, you might recall, we've held 2 webinars earlier this year in addition to today. In March, Larry Cooley and Maud Seegers from VVOB presented the newly developed Education Scalability Checklist, which is a diagnostic tool to determine the ease of scaling a particular education initiative, as well as to identify areas that might require additional consideration or adaptation to increase the likelihood of scaling. In September, we held a second webinar that focused on EdTech solutions and their scaling implications, especially for reaching those most marginalized. And this session featured presentations and discussions with a panel of working group members that included Mary Burns from the Education Development Center, Caitlin Koflan from R4D and the EdTech Hub, and Helen Namisi from Educate Uganda. And then we also participated in cross-working group webinars. In September, we partnered with the Monitoring and Evaluation and Health Working Groups to examine cases of large-scale interventions in health and education. In particular, doing sort of a deep dive into two major initiatives, the expanded use of community health workers and the remedial education approach teaching at the right level. And so here we are today to build on and go deeper into lessons around scaling and sustaining an education initiative by institutionalizing or embedding it further into formal education systems. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Gael to introduce the topic and our fantastic panelists and kick off the session.
Great, thank you so much, Jenny. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gael Simon. I'm a technical director at MSI, and I'm the co-chair, as Jenny mentioned, of the Scaling Up Education Working Group. I will be moderating the panel discussion today and invite participants to ask questions using the chat function. Our panelists will respond to your questions during the question and answers period towards the end. And that session will follow the panel presentation and the moderated discussion. So today we will be discussing how to get initiatives that originate outside of ministries of education institutionalized within government structures and operations. Institutionalization has been a big theme throughout the Scaling Up Community of Practice annual workshop. I hope some of you had the opportunity to participate in other sessions. We had a plenary session devoted to the issue, and also several thematic working groups addressing mainstreaming processes, successes, and challenges. So I really encourage all of you to visit the Scaling Up Community of Practice website to view those videos, and as well as a lot of other resources that address institutionalization. Today, specifically this morning, we will be discussing the extent to which education programs are scaled up and sustained by governments to deliver impact on the long term. We have 4 wonderful panelists today. We'll start with Heba Foda from the International Rescue Committee, Masuda Bano from Weiss and the University of Oxford, Jonathan Stern from RTI International, and Molly Curtis-West from the Brookings Institution Center for Universal Education. Our panelists will discuss how the institutionalization process actually happens in the education sector. We will look at processes and tools that support the process, as well as and we'll discuss some of the challenges and pitfalls with the process. We will look at whether there are elements of education initiatives that are more easily scaled and sustained, and we'll discuss the potential role of intermediary organizations in the process. So without further ado, we'll begin. Our first panelist is Heba Foda, who is the Scaling and Learning Manager at the Halan Simsim, an early childhood development program in Jordan. The Halam Simsim is a 5-year initiative set to reach more than 1 million children. The project partners with government and local early childhood development actors for the adaptation and uptake of the program into national systems and structures, thereby impacting a critical mass of young children across the region. In her role, Heba works collaboratively with ministries of education, health, and social development to change the systems that govern the provision of early childhood development services. She relies heavily on creating strong local partnerships that maintain the quality, research, and sustainability of services that target children, including refugees and the most vulnerable. And she uses a system strengthening approach to institutionalize Halam Simsim outcomes in government policies, ensuring that communities are served beyond the lifetime of the project. Heba, we'll get you going, and we're looking forward to hearing if you could provide a quick overview on Havilam Simsim, and tell us how you were able to work with the Ministry of Education on scaling early childhood development initiatives that respond to the ministry's priorities, as well as reflect the originating organization's work. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Gail. I've shared my screen. Let me know if you can see the slides. Yes.
We can.
Okay, perfect. So I'll start by introducing the Ahlan Simsim objective. And this is where we always start with outlining the objective to have sustained impact on children's lives in a cost-effective and replicable manner that is tailored to and integrated in existing early childhood development systems and structures across the region. So we have set the goal to reach over a period of 5 years, more than 1 million children. And to achieve this goal, we ensure that we need the enabling conditions that can contribute to more large-scale systems change, and these need to be established to ensure sustainable in-country change that is locally owned and managed for the benefit of future generations. And we always emphasize that we aim to change the systems that govern provision of ECD services, ensuring what services they provide and how they provide them reach children with high-quality programming, and also include refugees and the most vulnerable communities. This is achieved through a focus on creating strong local partnerships for quality, reach, and sustainability, and also grounding the work in a system-strengthening approach to local ownership. In our work, joint advocacy institutionalizes the scaling outcomes and government policies, ensuring that we are serving communities beyond the lifetime of the project. So in Jordan, we have what we call the scaling pathways. I will be focusing today on the Ministry of Education pathway. The specific objective of this pathway is to work with the Ministry of Education to expand access for children to quality early childhood education by integrating social and emotional learning and learning through play approaches into the Ministry of Education's curricula for children and trainings for teachers. We also work with the Ministry of Health, National Council of Family Affairs, and the Ministry of Social Development, and we also work with local CBOs in the south of Jordan. But I will focus today on the Ministry of Education. So in our work, we describe the scaling journey as stepping stones. So our scaling journey with the Ministry of Education includes 3 stepping stones. We worked first on the school readiness program, which was the pilot, or what we call our foot in the door with the ministry. And then through this intervention, we reached around 6,000 students. And then from there, we expanded with the remedial program that covered grade 1 students across all of Jordan. And with that, we reached 250,000 students. And now we're working on the scaling up part of it, which is the continuous professional development strategy for teachers. And this would reach all teachers of KG to grades 1, 2, and 3 in Jordan. So this is how we view our scaling journey as stepping stones. If I just have 1 minute, I would like to share some of the learnings that we've learned throughout this scaling process, and I've summarized them in 7 points. The first is that tailored interventions are important, so scaling is not limited to integrating a component, model, or activity within the existing service. We should be co-designing these tailored services that stem from our approach, the Ahlan Simsim approach, but respond to the needs of our strategic partners. A systems approach is essential. Every pathway that we work on is approached from within the system, and then all the scaling pathways together should be linked at some point to complement each other. And we also need to be agile and flexible. So the Ahlan Simsim program provides a great opportunity because it allows the team to explore emerging opportunities and allows for changes based on continuous changes in the system. In our work and scaling, we always need to influence a culture shift. So from the work with the Ministry of Education, we now know that the mindset shift does not happen from the first day. We cultivate champions in the ministries that we work with over time, and this influences a culture shift. And we always need to adhere by partnerships principles in our work with the ministries. So partnership management and development is a trajectory. It has ups and downs, but we always need to maintain partnership principles throughout the ups and downs to build a strong partnership. And lastly, we need to model sustainability, and this is something we've learned recently when we're talking about sustainability, especially with ministries and countries that have worked extensively with INGOs. We understand it differently, and every partner has a different understanding of it. So grounding it in realistic interventions that are relevant to the needs of the ministry is so much better than talking about sustainability in abstract terms. Thank you, that's all for me.
Thank you very much, Heba. I just have a quick question. As you mentioned, well, actually, I had two questions, but then you mentioned sustainability, and that kind of piqued my interest as well. You talked about the systems approach, and I was wondering if you could give us an example of how you've approached that and what you mean by a systems approach, and also sustainability, if you have any lessons that you've learned along the way about sustainability in terms of how you approach that and how you make sure that you address sustainability early on in the process.
Yeah, so for the systems approach for us in Jordan, it was important to understand the system that governs ECD and ECD service provision. And in Jordan, we have the Human Resource Development Strategy that outlines the main Bible for outlining ECD objectives on a national level. So when we were identifying the scaling pathways, designing with the partners the scaling pathways, we always made sure to refer back to the HRDS, the Human Resource Development Strategy, to make sure that we are aligning with the ACED objectives. So this is in terms of national priorities, but also looking at the interventions and how they complement each other. So with the Ministry of Health, we're working with children from before they are born, when their mothers are going to the clinics and then receiving the vaccines and the checkup visits, to integrate the services there. And then with the Ministry of Social Development and the National Council of Family Affairs, once the child is in the nursery, to have a quality management system. And then later on in KG, they have a readiness program, and then grades 1, 2, and 3, where teachers are trained on these similar models and comprehensive early childhood interventions. So this is what we mean by a system. We have to understand the system that is providing these services and where the gaps are, and then to ensure that we are complementing their service throughout the early years of children. In terms of sustainability, this was a very interesting experience we've had recently with the Ministry of Health, where we had a lot of resistance from the ministry in terms of thinking of the sustainability and scalability of services, or the first stepping stone of it. And there was a lot of resistance because I think the ministry focal point is used to INGO short-term direct implementation projects, where sustainability is a box that you check, but not something that you design around from the start. So when we were asking what is the sustainability plan for this, how do you think this would be sustainable for years to come, there was a lot of resistance in terms of thinking about this. But when we started grounding it in actual things like the healthcare professionals training strategy and where the gaps are, they opened the door for us to actually explore if we can integrate into that. And that's our institutionalization window of opportunity. But I think at one point we realized that we're talking about very different things in terms of sustainability. And now we take the approach of understanding the systems and structures that exist and trying to identify certain gaps in them, and then proposing to the ministries, what if we work on a continuous professional development strategy? What if we work on a strategy for awareness for your ministry? There's a lot of more buy-in and ownership there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heba. Next, we will hear from Masuda Bano, who is the research lead for the RISE Political Economy team. She is Professor of Development Study at the Oxford Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. Her primary area of interest is in studying the role of ideas and beliefs in development processes, in their evolution and change. She builds large-scale comparative studies combining ethnographic and survey data. Within the education sector, she has particularly focused on studying the efficiency of non-formal school models, quality of learning in low-fee charging private schools versus state schools, and collaborative models between state and non-state providers to improve quality of education provision. In December 2020, Masuda and Weiss published a working paper titled Enabling Innovation in State Systems, Lessons from Pratham in India. It looked at factors that support the institutionalization of a very successful and well-known program within state systems, as well as challenges to the replication and sustainability of such programs. Masuda, what did you learn about institutionalization of education projects from your study of Pratham? And what were some of the key factors that facilitated scaling up? What were some of the unexpected challenges that hindered replication and sustainability? And if you could talk a little bit about how Pratham supported the institutionalization process, given that it was first directly implementing the project and then was in the process of transferring it to the state. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks for raising these questions, because the paper precisely, like, that's the focus of the paper. We are trying to address these kind of issues. And it's just one study, and it's a qualitative study, so study that we do. And Pratham, as you mentioned, I'm assuming a lot of audience knows already, it's one of a very visible, one of the largest almost and very visible organized NGO in India working in education. And part of the reason it's very noticeable today is that it's working very systematically across a lot of Indian states, and it's working with the state. So that's where the focus, that's why we selected it for this study, because it's it does multiple interventions, but it's one particular program, which is called Teaching at the Right Level, has become very influential, not just in India, because many Indian states have, state governments have tried to adopt it, and that's what I'll tell you what the findings from there are. But also internationally, it's being replicated, say in certain countries in Africa. So that's the particular program we are looking at. And what to answer, to come now straight to the questions you were raising, what we are finding is that the paper tries to ask that what is it that find an innovation by an NGO, education NGO is successful? Because when you're looking for education challenges and how to solve them, one issue is that is it a technical solution that we need? I mean, there are different ways to intervene in education. One is that can we come up with better teaching models? So this one is a bit like that. It's that kind of intervention where Pratham is quite successful in trialing this model, which helps children at a very low cost learn better. The learning outcomes measured in many experiments and all are improved. It's established through this Pratham intervention. So we are saying that fine, now this when such an innovation has been identified by an NGO, can it be systematically embedded in state? And that's what we try to look, because Pratham has partnered with different states, and we focus on the state of Bihar in India, because that's where Pratham has had a very ongoing long partnership, and the state has attempted to adopt this teaching at the right level, this method, quite systematically. So in terms of our findings, what do we find? The issue is that, first of all, the paper highlights that we need to understand when we talk about adoption of innovation by an NGO or embedding it within state system, is this that you need to understand the process at two levels, and even the motivations at two levels. And that's first one is of the politicians and the bureaucrats who are responsible for agreeing to, they see a successful case and they have to be convinced, either convinced or they themselves see it and get convinced, the desire to adopt it, the decision-making process, that they agree, first of all, that we should try to copy their system. And the second level we have to look at is that even when they agree, the issue is that new method has to be implemented by the first line, what you can say service providers, the teachers, the principals, the district officers. So to assume that the two work, just because the top layer agrees to adopt the policy, it will be automatically implemented, doesn't work that way. I mean, that's one of the things we highlight, because as we can tell you, as I'll tell you right now, different factors shape the willingness to cooperate at these two different levels. So at the top level, because Pratham in Bihar for the last 15 years, government has been engaging with it, but in different ways. Like I'll tell you, currently right now, the partnership is not going that well, while historically it has had very long active partnership. So I'll come to that point later. But first of all, what made it work when it did work well? And so what we are seeing is that Pratham, by the time, in this particular case, one of the bureaucrats in the district in Bihar state, where Pratham was doing very active work, had approached Pratham and they had approached, and that's one of the points we're highlighting. They approached because the success of Pratham on the ground was very visible. So the thing is, if you have visibility and evidence of success, and even by the time they were working in Bihar, they had a lot of studies published even by JPEL, because JPEL has been involved with them. Experimental based evidence and all that, their method leads to improved learning outcomes. So the evidence on the ground that the bureaucrat saw in his own district, combined with the research evidence, first of all, became one of the first convincing points. So evidence of success matters. Secondly, given time is short, I'm going to highlight the main factors that we say are helping. Secondly, the thing is that ease of how easy it is to replicate or adopt, because government bureaucracies are dense processes. They know they have to be implemented across these multiple tiers. Even the bureaucrats know, the politicians know. So the thing is, Teral approach is very simple. I don't have time right now to go into it, but if you're interested, have a look at the paper, because the teaching method is very simple, but it improves learning outcome. It's in fact a bit simpler than what the teachers normally do. So the ease of method was a very important factor in the politicians and the government bureaucrats getting convinced we should do it. And then the fact that there was I've already highlighted, a committed bureaucrat was around. So that if you can find somebody, a champion, let's call it this way, within the bureaucracy to take the case to the politicians, because ultimately the funding and all has to come through the politician's approval. But to have a politician, a bureaucrat who generally get convinced and becomes the champion for it, helps like in adoption of the model. And then one fourth point, and this will link up to why we are now seeing a decline in that cooperation at this particular point in time, is this that there has to be a political opportunity. That's what we are finding in this paper. For the government to adopt it, a bureaucrat can get generally convinced, because you have reformist kind of bureaucrats who want to improve. But in terms of in countries where democracies are generally weak, what you find is that if politicians do come forward to endorse a good practice or something which is for public welfare, it's often led by a very desire for as an opportunity to promote themselves. So it's not a commitment, it's not a political will. And that's what we find. I mean, you have to read the paper for it, or Gail, later on you can ask me in question answers. The whole paper is eventually trying to explain the struggle with that, because it's a model that works. We know the evidence, the government commits to it, starts giving funds. 7-8 years they work together, but in the long term, the government does not give it that kind of commitment, mainly because the chief minister bought it in the beginning because it was suiting his agenda at that time. It gave him a lot of publicity. But the commitment required in the long term to promote this model, he just did not have that political will. Do you understand? And the democracy in general in the state is weak, so it's not that people could pressure him to, carry on. So the political. So this is the main point we can discuss a bit later. The whole issue between a politician using political opportunity to promote by adopting something, but then it's temporary versus a long-term political will. And just to quickly, it'll take 1 more minute or 2 more minutes quickly on the ground level. So that's more at the high level adoption, the decision. And then when you start implementing, what we find is that the paper gives you quite a few examples, but in different way. The 2-3 main messages are that basically the simpler the model, the easier, because the teachers and principals and all, you have to look at the capacity of these people, especially when you're working, say, in developing countries where they might have a low starting point. So again, the ease of method helps, but also a lot of hand holding. So rather than, holding them too much, rather than going for a very accountability based model where you pressure teachers and all, my Pratham model is very much about being there, supporting teachers, giving them a lot of credit. Even if the Pratham own teachers or officers do something, they'll go and praise the teacher that, because of you it happened. Do you understand? So so basically the message from that level is that if you want the low tier who have to implement it, if you want them to absorb and get committed to the model, you have to first of all make it accessible for them, make it easy. But secondly, give them a lot of confidence and a lot of encouragement and credit for it. So, so at that level, that is important. And and ultimately the thing is that, like I said, in the long term, what we're finding is that you need for them to be embedded, for these programs to be embedded systematically in state systems, you need long time, because they're not. So because I'm raising this because in Bihar case, we had 7-8 years, good years, where the government was with them, but it wasn't, and time wasn't enough to embed it systematically. You knew that trainers had to be trained in the state system, the teachers had to be trained, it had to be brought down to the lowest tier. And before that could happen, the chief minister had his own political agenda. He moved towards more visible, educational outcomes like investments, which for which you could get more political credit, like building of schools, all of that, moving away from quality of education kind of target. And the last point I'd like to then finish with is that what we learn from that is that given that in these kind of contexts, the political will might be missing, and it's just like opportunistic behavior by politicians, the only way you can embed it is this: that if the NGO that is implementing this program or is introducing the innovation is locally embedded, as opposed to be very donor funded, because donor funded, as soon as the government withdraws and donor withdraws, they cannot survive. Pratham's strength is this, that it's very community mobilized initiative. So, and they have a very extensive community. They worked very extensively through the community members, volunteer teachers, all of that. So the issue is that even though Bihar right now, the government is not that actively cooperating, but there was a phase in between 5 years ago also that this happened. But Bihar, the lesson is that Pratham stuck around. So if you have the ability to stick around because you are not reliant entirely on the state government contribution, but have active community participation, then sooner or later the government will again have the incentive to come back to you. Do you understand? Because you have been around for a while, they've tried you. So now we are hoping that, I mean, the signs that in the same chief minister now re-elected, it will re-engage. Do you understand? Because Pratham is still around, and there's quite a bit of learning that happened, but true embedding might take 15, 20 years. That's one of the main things, because these state systems are complex. Anyway, I'll finish there.
No, this is wonderful. Thank you so much, Masuda. And I know you're an expert in political economy, and you kind of touched on that as well, and I find that fascinating. So I was wondering, in your opinion, how can NGOs and projects, and perhaps even government, better develop an awareness of political economy prior to engaging in the institutionalization process, and whether or not this is even critical? I think I understand from what you just said that you have these two layers that are not always very well aligned, but it seems that having a better understanding of the relationship between the two probably, but also just the political economy in that particular context is quite critical.
Gail, I would say, to be honest, it's less something that the politicians themselves will benefit or can do anything with, because it's more a tool for analysis. So it's for the academics, for the NGOs to understand the process. So Pratham itself will benefit. For example, this study, when they read it themselves, they've gone through the process, but the analysis helps sort of put it in context that these are the political economic factors that impacted your work in Bihar. Because of course, from their own learning, they might reflect on all, but often organizations are so busy they don't reflect on what worked, what did not work. So in this case, like a study like this helps them sort of say, okay, this is the political economy context that impacted your ability to, embed in the state or not to do that. So I think it really, when we talk about political economy, it's something for the academics because we want to publish and write about, contribute to that kind of theoretical framework. It's for the NGOs, for the think tanks who want to influence the process, understand the process, like the political and economic factors that shape otherwise apparently an education decision. But you understand, by political economy, we're trying to say that the so-called education decision is not purely an education decision. It's based on the political and economic interests, like the political elites and the incentives and the economic context around it. So I think it's more an analytical tool which can be used by practitioners and all. But government itself, because they are the actors being studied, I doubt they are that interested in getting engaged in the process.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think that's a very good lead-in for Jonathan and his study and what he's learned. So Jonathan Stern is a senior researcher at RTI International. Jonathan has over 15 years of experience in educational research and evaluation, and he has provided technical expertise and assistance to education programs and ministries of education in more than 20 countries throughout his career. He currently serves as principal investigator for the Learning at Scale and Play Accelerator research programs, both of which are cross-country research initiatives focused on understanding how early grade education intervention works at scale. Jonathan, I think it's great that you're following after Masuda's intervention, because I'm very curious to know what you've learned from your cross-country study about how government systems are able to ensure effective implementation at scale and hopefully sustain it as well.
Yeah, thanks. I feel like I'm also thankful that I'm going after Masuda, because several of the things that she mentioned about, having the champion in the ministry, having the extended timeline to to do these things, right? Having the turnover in ministry priorities. I mean, so many of those things are the same issues that that we grapple with in our work, and that these programs have been grappling with as well. So, so most of those I don't even have to focus on because they were already discussed. So let me just see if I can share this briefly. So the Learning at Scale study, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a Gates-funded initiative that started a couple of years ago. The intention of it was to try and understand how it is that programs were able to be effective at a measure of scale that's typically not common in development work. We see a lot of successful pilot programs, and we see fewer that have the ability to have measured, rigorous evaluations that show effectiveness at large scale. And so we were tasked with identifying 8 programs with success or evidence of success, and to study 3 main questions about them. The first was focused on the instructional practices that lead to change in student performance and impact. The second was on instructional supports, and the third was on the system supports. So today we're obviously going to talk a little bit more on that third question and the system support side of things. These are the 8 programs that were ultimately selected for the Learning at Scale study across 7 programs. One of them is actually Pratham's work in India, so they're included here in this discussion twice in some ways because of Masuda's great work as well. One thing you'll notice, we did not do this intentionally when we set out to find these programs, but 6 of these 8 programs were primarily USAID funded. And all 8 were implementer-led programs and not fully government-led programs. Neither of those, as I said, were intentional, but it does say something about the programs that exist at scale with this type of evidence and the types of things that they're working on. So as a result, some of our findings are tied very much in, this is what USAID as a donor tends to focus on, and therefore this is what these programs are doing, somewhat commonly as well. If we just kind of boil it down to a handful of main things, I think these are probably what we would say are some of the most essential characteristics of system support for these programs to be able to work at scale with and through the government sector, right? The idea for all of these, different from some other work, is that we were not looking at how these programs went to scale. By the time we were looking at them, they were already working at scale with a level of effectiveness. So we were just trying to get a better understanding of how they were able to work at that level. Very similar, I think, to some of what Masuda was saying, on this first point, establishing clear priorities was essential, and it was based in a lot of cases on having evidence on the front end. Right, so it was very common for ministries to say something along the lines of, why are we focusing just on reading? Right, there are so many other initiatives we could be focusing on, even within early grade education. But if they had national assessment data or other data that showed that there was a lack in reading skills, then it was something that they could point to say, this is something we need to work on. Then here are some of the ways that we're going to address it. So that evidence was really key for establishing priorities on the front end. The second was the alignment of the priorities and plans with existing government plans. This is another thing that was really, really key, right? That it was rarely going to work if a program was coming in with entirely new plans that were, parallel or even adverse to what the government was intending to focus on, or where they were trying to go with their education system. So that alignment was key for buy-in, and especially in situations where you have often such significant turnover at high levels of the ministry. That becomes something that becomes more complicated as these programs go on. It was not uncommon for a program to have buy-in from ministry at the start because it did align with government priorities and plans. And then halfway through a program, a new ministry or new government had taken over. And now all of a sudden it no longer aligned in the same way. So in those cases, it was often essential for these programs to shift in a reasonable way to align with the new priorities, or to have sufficient evidence to convince the new government of the effectiveness of their approach to continue it moving forward. Third is about the communicating program expectations down the system. This is, I think, probably goes without saying. I mean, maybe many of these go without saying, but this probably more than most, that there was no way you were going to be able to have a large-scale program working within a government system through public schools without the government setting the expectations from a high level and sending communications down through districts and into schools about the need to participate and the need to be involved in the work. But it is something that came up from both sides in our discussions and reviews of documents, programs noting the importance of always having that communication go through ministries, and ministries noting the importance of, especially in more centralized systems, where that information comes from the top, and when it feeds down to schools, it's something that people will participate in, where they'd be much more reluctant to do so if it's seen as coming from an outside organization. Regular monitoring of programs was also important. However, this was one that I think was probably least commonly done through the system in the way that I think was initially intended. I think that a lot of general monitoring was done by the system, but most of the actual program monitoring itself, or most of the monitoring of implementation of these programs itself, was still done by the programs. So this is kind of one piece that I think, even if they were working with government or ministry coaches, for example, the oversight and overall measurement of their responsibilities was still often done by the program. So an area for improvement, I think. And then the last is kind of on providing capacity building efforts. This is particularly key at decentralized levels with district and school level staff to ensure that they had an understanding of what the key components of the program were, such that they would be able to sustain at least some components of that moving forward. I think without that capacity building, obviously there's no real likelihood of there being any level of uptake. But as we have been talking about already, and will continue to talk about for the next remainder of this webinar as well, it's a question of degree, right? What level of capacity building and what level of additional support is needed in order for things to actually be institutionalized and sustained moving forward, as opposed to something that can be carried on during a program, but then fades and eventually disappears, once the program is gone. So I think in that regard, a few just key things that I think that we noticed when examining these programs, even with their levels of success, as I noted, one is that some of the main components, often distribution of materials and overall monitoring of the program's implementation, were still done by programs. It was something that was more difficult to pass on to government systems. I think system actors tended to very much appreciate their continued involvement. So there were always steering committees. There were every time a new annual plan was created by a program, it was run by the government and they would have input, and that was obviously important. However, when we got to conversations about, but then who did this piece? Almost invariably, that piece of whatever the implementation was still really done by the programs themselves and less so by the governments. And I think without a change in that, there's really not much likelihood that once the program ends, regardless of the amount of sensitization and capacity building that's done, that the government could have any real expectation of continuing to do it or to the same degree that was done if they didn't have that firsthand involvement in the implementation on the front end. Every program did institutionalize some components. There were none that institutionalized everything. This is not necessarily surprising, and we can talk a bit more about what some of those things were that tended to be institutionalized more or less than others. And last is, and this is what I was saying kind of on the previous side too, the sustainability piece. It's not just about providing capacity during the time of the program. I think of it in terms of the way that we think of teachers being developed through these programs as well, that there are continued phases of professional development throughout a teacher's career. And I feel like we would need to have the same expectation for ministry staff to take on something new and different from their typical job function, that there would need to be some sort of continued professional development that allows them to grow and learn and continue to ask questions and develop their skills. Whereas once a program is gone, often that means that they're left on their own to just try and remember what was done or what was given to them previously. And I think that's a really hard thing for them to carry on without the required support. So that's kind of, I think, the big picture of where we landed with the system integration piece.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. No, this is very fascinating, and I'm gonna come back to you so we can talk about the elements that were scaled and sustained, because I think there's a lot of linkages between what you've said, but also what Heba and Masuda have said. Since you were looking at the whole programs, but Masuda was looking at a specific aspect of Pratham's program, and I'm curious to know what Heba is thinking in terms of sustainability and institutionalization of Halam Simsim. However, in the interest of time, before we get to that critical question, I would like to move on to Molly, and then we'll come back and talk about those different elements. Thank you. So Molly Curtis Weiss is a project manager and senior research analyst at Brookings Institution's Center for Universal Education. Since 2017, she has worked on the Millions Learning Project, which focuses on improving quality education and learning for children and youth in developing countries at large scale. Most recently, she co-authored the report, Improving Children's Reading and Math at Large Scale in Côte d'Ivoire, the story of scaling up Programme d'enseignement ciblé, a remedial education approach to improving early grade reading and math, adapted from teaching at the right level. So we'll keep talking about Pratham and some of the elements from that program that are being scaled. Molly will introduce or reintroduce for some of us the Institutionalization Tracker, a tool designed to help implementers, policymakers, and funders measure the progress of integrating an initiative into existing education system and identifying areas that require additional attention for further integration, which I think links up very well with what Jonathan was talking about in terms of sustainability and the role of professional development. Molly? Could you tell us a little bit about the education building blocks that are included in the Institutionalization Tracker? Why were they chosen? And how has the tracker been used to track progress towards institutionalization to date?
Sure. And it seems like my sharing of slides isn't working super well. So let me just try it again really quickly. It appears to be showing you all everything. Is that right? Which is not ideal. So let me just try and reshare. But thanks so much. So as you said, I'm going to present or share our newly published Institutionalization Tracker. And the purpose of this tool is kind of what it sounds like. It's to track efforts to institutionalize an initiative within a formal education system. And the intention is really that it be used as a dynamic planning tool to identify areas that require additional effort and to inform the plans to address the gaps identified. Can you see the slides? Is that working better now? Okay, great. So just to start off by saying that this tool was developed based on an existing tool called the Assess Institutionalization of the Intervention Package tool, which was developed by JPEGO, MSI, and ExpandNet to support scaling in reproductive maternal, newborn, child, and adolescent health. So a lot of our partners had expressed to us that they were looking for a way to sort of track the nuances of institutionalization in their own work. And so we were really excited to see that this tool had been created, but because it was specific to health, we found that it couldn't be applied sort of directly as written to education initiatives. And so we took the opportunity to adapt it to the education sector, drawing from sources including the World Bank's The Bear and the National Center on Education and Economy's 9 building blocks for a world-class education system. In terms of development, we also gathered written feedback from partners in multiple countries, colleagues, the original authors of the tool, an international advisory group, and many others. And we piloted also in Botswana, Cote d'Ivoire, Jordan, and Tanzania, continuing to revise it based on everyone's feedback. An initial version was published this past July, but our intention is really hoping that people test it out, use it, provide feedback, and we can continue to refine it as time goes on. So maybe I can share a few overarching points of the tool, what it is and is not used for, before showing you the various components. We recommend that the tool be completed through a discussion between a group of key stakeholders who are engaged in a scaling process, particularly those people who can make decisions and act on the tool's findings. Of course, who that is depends on the initiative and the context. But the hope is that the same group of stakeholders would use the tool at regular intervals to assess their progress and determine actions to strengthen and advance their efforts at institutionalization. I would note a couple things. This tool measures progress of efforts related to a single government agency or ministry. As it's written, you'll see it's for the Ministry of Education, but it certainly could be used for another ministry if relevant. It would just need some slight tailoring. Similarly, it's currently designed to track progress at a national level, but it could also be used at a sub-national level. Those sort of nuances would just need to be specified, I think, before using the tool. This tool also is not meant to determine if an initiative should scale. It's not meant to assess the strength of an existing education system, and it definitely doesn't track other important aspects of scaling like impact and quality. And so we would say that ideally it really should be complemented with other scaling metrics and assessments. And the last thing I would underscore is that you'll see a big part of the tool is assigning scores, but we would say definitely the exact score selected is a lot less important than using that information to inform action. So let me just quickly dive into what the tool looks like. The first step, as I was beginning to allude to, is that this group of stakeholders really should specify their assumptions when completing the tool. And the idea would be that each subsequent time it's completed, they revisit these assumptions to make sure they still hold true or to update them if necessary. So this would include together detailing what specifically are we institutionalizing, what is our end goal, what is the target ministry, all those specifics that will make it more helpful. Then we jump really into sort of the meat of the tool, which is assigning a score for each institutional element. So this is an extract from the tool, and as you can see, it is organized by education system building blocks, each of which is broken down into specific elements. And then for each element, there's a related question, and then a criteria to consider when assigning a score. And then lastly, a column providing an explanation for the score that's selected. So as you can see, it's based on a scale of 1 to 4. 1 is low institutionalization, 4 is full institutionalization. So for each element, the group would agree on what the current stage is, and then include a few sentences detailing why they think this score is most appropriate. Again, the exact number, less important than sort of the analysis of where we stand. And this is just one row. The full tool is of a much larger rubric with many rows, each looking at different aspects and elements of institutionalization. So once the full rubric is filled out, the next step is to analyze the results. Again, we're hoping this is not just a documentation exercise, but really an exercise to spur action. So one potential way, though not the only way, to look at the information at a glance would be to use something like this, a radar chart or a spider graph, to really facilitate this group discussion. So it can be the visual display really is to help identify where have we made progress so far, maybe where is progress stalling, where is progress not been made so far, to inform what we do next. And as you can see in this example, if the tool is used multiple times, we can include multiple rounds of data to sort of show even more clearly where we've made progress since our last assessment and maybe where we haven't made progress. So the last thing is that, of course, time and capacity are limited. We can't work on every element of institutionalization all at once. And as you look at the tool, there's a lot of different elements. So it's too much to try and focus on all at one time. So the final step of using the tool is for key stakeholders to determine a small number of priority areas to focus on that they think are most important for furthering the institutionalization process. Again, the goal is not really to get to all fours, but really to identify what is priority right now, maybe where do we have the most leverage on, or what do we think is furthest behind, how are we going to make progress on these priorities, and then to outline concrete and feasible actions to undertake within the next 6 to 12 months in order to make progress towards this larger goal that we specified in the beginning. So I am maybe going to stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions, and just say it's great to have gone at the end, because I think, thinking about these different elements of institutionalization that are included in the tool, they really do speak to all the different points the previous 3 panelists made. And then lastly, I can put a link to the tool. We have it in English, French, and Spanish in the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Molly. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions to our panelists before we move on to questions from participants. Again, I would encourage participants to either put their questions in the chat box or to raise their hand, and we will get to you and give you an opportunity to ask those questions. But before we do, I do want to go back to that question of what elements were most scaled or sustained by governments from Jonathan's study, but also from Masuda and Heba's experiences. What were some of these elements? We talked about having a simple approach, simple technical approach. Molly talked about having key priorities to focus on. Could you give us a few examples and tell us why those particular elements were sustained and institutionalized? Anybody who wants to start, go ahead.
I'm happy to start just briefly. I think that, we could talk about specifics, and maybe there are a couple of good examples, but I think as a larger picture thing, the elements that tended to be sustained were the ones that really built off of something that existed in the system as opposed to introducing something new to the system. So the simplest example is probably something like curriculum, right? That it wasn't uncommon for there to be a curriculum revision process that the program had a large hand in, and then that led to a new curriculum or education work plan for the government system moving forward. So that was something that kind of got brought in. I think when it was something like materials, which no matter how much the government might have liked the materials that were used, what we would often find is if a program worked in, let's call it 100 districts, and you said something about, are the materials still used? The government officials would often say, yes, materials are still used. We love them. They're fantastic. And then the question would be, what about outside of those districts? And they would say, oh, no. Like, we didn't have the ability to create new materials or to, do something like that. So that level of institution was really just carryover of something that existed in the program that they could continue to use or do. But I think the key was it being something that the system already had the function for in the first place, and it was just a revision of it or a slight change to it once it was introducing an entirely new either part of implementation or a new plan. Then I think those were the pieces that were much more difficult for systems to take over.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan. Masuda or Heba, any thoughts on that?
I think I can just add that because I'll just follow on, endorse what Jonathan partly has said, because Pratham, like we said, teaching at the right level is a very important part of work that Pratham does, but it's one of the main interventions. So if I look at it, the whole reason it was adopted is similar, like what Jonathan said, that it works with the system. It's not trying to introduce something entirely different. It's just an approach on how you can teach using the same material, but in a slightly different way. And the tools they give you for it are actually very simple, low cost, all of that. So it's like teachers doing the same thing, but slightly differently. So do you understand? So it was complementing the system, not trying to replace it in any way. The entire program, I think that's the appeal of the entire intervention, actually.
So for us, I think the important factors for institutionalization or designing for sustainability was that we ensured from the start to engage the Ministry of Education Technical Committee in adapting the curriculum, the school readiness program, the remedial. So even in terms of visibility, which us INGOs care a lot about, we had the logo of the Ministry of Education. So this is developed, adapted, and owned by the ministry. And in terms of institutionalization, we looked for these opportunities where there's an existing system that's functioning, that's already funded by the Ministry of Education, and we just inserted the components that the ministry had a need for, which were the social emotional learning and learning through play, into this existing and fully running system. So now teachers are trained on it as part of a larger package, and it doesn't stand out as this is the Ahlan Simsim or IRCs as much as this is the ministry's content, and the ministry sees the need and importance of it. So I think these two things were very important for us in the design phase to ensure sustainability and full institutionalization.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience. You all mentioned the relationship with government institutions, shifting priorities, and Jonathan, I think in particular, mentioned high turnover. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how organizations can maintain those relationships with government when there is consistent shift in priorities, as well as high turnover within the ministries. Anybody want to go first?
Sorry, Gail, can you repeat the question? I think I got distracted slightly.
Oh, sure. No. So I guess my question is just how do you maintain a relationship and support the institutionalization process when you have shifting priorities at the governmental level and you have high turnover rate? So your champions throughout your institutionalization process may change in the middle of the process. So how do you maintain those relationships to support that process?
Can I go first?
Yes, please, Heba.
I think this is a very interesting question, and we always think about this in IRC because we have the peer system and the partnerships principles, and I think it's the same as maintaining any relationship. You listen carefully to the needs of the ministry, the other partner, and you try to, as much as possible, to be responsive to their needs, and that's sometimes, as we call it, the foot in the door. So sometimes we need to implement, the pilots or the short-term intervention that makes the ministry's champion look good in front of their peers or their supervisors in the ministry, and then they will slowly open the door for you, for their system, for the gaps in their system. They will not tell you that in the first even 3, 4, 5 meetings. You need to establish trust. You need to show them that you can give them what they need to, meet their deliverables, their milestones, look good in front of their supervisors, and then slowly they will open the door for you to actually be transparent and honest about the gaps in their systems, what opportunities you can piggyback on, and even the coordination actors who they're working with, how you can coordinate with these actors to make your intervention more complementary. So yeah, it goes back to I think, relationship management and just being close in communication and listening and being responsive to their needs.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that, and of course, it's coming from a little bit different perspective, looking at a tool rather than a case study, but the tool was sort of built in response to the cases of our partners and some of the challenges that they were experiencing, which certainly turnover is a frequent one we heard about. And one of the other approaches we had heard worked well for them which is tried to be reflected in the tool, is transitioning beyond a single champion or a few champions at a single level to really have champions at different levels, at different types of roles, to try and avoid some of that turnover. So not avoiding high-level champions, but also looking for different places in the system and really sort of distributing those relationships to avoid some of that natural issue, as well as thinking about other aspects of institutionalization beyond champions that maybe can also be more durable beyond this change. So I think what Jonathan was saying about a lot of the cases having some elements institutionalized, but not all, similar to one of the challenges or experiences the tool we've worked on is looking to sort of support and thinking about what are the other aspects of institutionalization maybe we haven't made progress on yet, but that could be useful to push forward. And so some things are more ingrained in the system and might be a little bit more resilient to that type of turnover.
I think maybe one other just really quick thing that I don't know how easy this would be in the duration of a program, but thinking about, ultimate institutionalization or sustainability after a program is gone and when there's turnover there and you have different priorities in this in a new government or a new ministry. I think one of the things that doesn't happen often, but I think could be essential, and a lot of the systems change research would say this as well, is the need to change job descriptions and job functions in order for there to be sustained impacts, right? I think that it's relatively easy to have a coach within a program do something that they are being paid to do or asked to do as a part of the program. But until it's clear that within the ministry system, their job function is now to do X, once that program ends or once a new leadership comes in, I think it's much more likely that they would refer back to, well, this is what my job is supposed to be. This is what I always used to do. So I'm going to go back to doing that. And so without those changes, I think you're always going to have a difficult time ensuring that you have the longer term sustainability.
And just quickly, again, from Pratham stuff, I already highlighted, so I won't take long, is this one that here it's a slightly different. The examples we've got from the others is the bureaucrats changing, which is a very routine thing, so you have to keep sort of rebuilding relationship. One goes, the other one comes in. So all those routine things are here. Are in the paper a bit too, but the main challenge we face is that when the partnership is long term, it's 7-8 years and it's now 20 years in Bihar case. But the phase is when it gets really intense and then it goes down and then but it revives. And in order to ensure that it's long term and it's embedded and it can revive, that's where the point I made, that the community embeddedness is very important, because Pratham is not a project that winds up and goes away after 5 years, and that kind of projects will never embed, in my view, in these kind of complex systems, because you do need 15 to 20 years if to be around. Even if there stops, then you start again, pick up. Without that, I think it's very unlikely it can embed forever, change the system systematically. And that's
wonderful. Thank you so much. No, this was great. This was a really great conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Jenny right now, because I saw that there were a lot of good questions and comments in the chat box. Jenny?
Sure, absolutely. What a fantastic conversation. If it's okay with you, Gael, maybe we'll go over 10 minutes or so into the planning part of the conversation so we can have a little bit more conversation with the audience. Okay, so I'm going to try to group maybe the first set of questions. There were a few for you, Jonathan. Maybe I'll share them all and then we'll go around and let folks respond. So Jonathan, a few questions for you from Johannes and Andy in particular related to financing a bit. So one from Johannes, Jonathan, is what guidance would you have for USAID, given that you said 6 of those programs were initially financed by USAID? What could they have done differently to support institutionalization, to make it more effective, sustainable? More specifically, was enough thought given to what happens when the project ends, or certainly when AID pulls out from the start? And related to, I get that a bit, Andy was asking, are projects crowding out government investments in their own capacity related to scaling? Actually, why don't I start with you so I don't overwhelm all the panelists and let you respond to that, and then I'll share a few others.
Sure. Yeah, no, they're fantastic questions, and I was trying to respond to some of them in the chat, but I'm glad you asked them so that I can respond verbally. I think it's a little easier to get the point across too. But I think on what USAID could have done differently, there surely could have been more of an emphasis on the institutionalization and sustainability component of it. But that being said, within almost all of these programs, there was a system strengthening component to the program, right? There was an aspect specifically focused on institutionalization and transfer of responsibility and handover and sustainability. However, it's all about competing responsibilities within the program. And as long as these programs are ultimately being held accountable for affecting change in student outcomes, that's going to remain the priority to a large degree for most of these programs, right? So I think that sustainability piece, of course, they're going to work with the government, but I think it's, as we sort of talked about earlier, in some ways it's easy to say, yes, we engaged the government and we built their capacity. And then you look a little more deeply and see, but you still implemented much of it on your own. But that's because they required that control in order to ensure that they could get the outcomes that they needed at the student level. And so I think that competing responsibility for implementers is always going to make it really hard for them to focus on the institutionalization piece. But also, maybe in addition to that, that institutionalization piece is going to take a really long time, right? So one of the things I noted in the chat too was that even if we're saying, well, they only were able to institutionalize 2 or 3 things, that still should be seen as a pretty big success, right? If you have a 3 to 5 year program and you're trying to talk about large scale system change and you're able to, institutionalize 2 or 3 components, that's a great thing and it's on its own, because whole scale change for a system is going to take significantly longer than that. And so I think that's just one thing we need to keep in mind about the relative value of even these small scale changes. The crowding out thing, and there was another question on finance as well. It's hard, right? I mean, I think that we're always going to be in this situation where USAID and other donors tend to develop these programs with ministries, supposedly, right, to prioritize what it is that they are interested in. But there's still that donor focus that is on, specific to what they want as well. And so I think, that having pure alignment there is always going to be difficult. And there was another question about what does it mean when you're relying on that external funding? And I think that's just the reality in which we work right now, that relying on external funding is something that many governments are going to continue to do. And unless institutionalization becomes the ultimate focus and priority for that external funding, then the other things that are going to get the government money, which may not be focused specifically on institutionalization, are going to continue to really lead the majority of the work that's being done. So.
Fantastic, thanks. No, I think that speaks to Masuda's point about the long-term nature and some of these more sort of intangibles that are difficult to track and follow. To your point, Jonathan, the sort of tension of showing some quick wins versus the reality of what does it really take and look like for joint implementation along the way. And then I know Christine also made the point in the chat box, which I would agree, is when you say, 2 to 3 components might not be bad, that actually might be exactly what the system needs and wants, right? I mean, if we're thinking about embedding an entire model, maybe that's a problem in and of itself, because we're saying there's a sort of, rigid model, organization, brand that needs to be wholesale adopted by a system. And that sort of, thinking about Hiba and your point about, what the system can, the gaps and the needs, that might not be it. All right, Masuda, a few questions for you. Larissa wanted to know what allowed Pratham to stick around before bureaucrats showed an interest. And Abe wanted to know, given the long-term history of TARL in India, why was it still seen as external after so many years of it being embedded in the government? And the last one, from Ian, which is, and this might be pointing us to the paper, but how is Pratham addressing some of the current sort of challenges or stall in progress that you spoke to?
So actually, Jenny, I think the first one and the last one can be combined. The House Pratham sustaining right now, in Bihar, because this paper looks at a particular partnership in Bihar with the state, because Pratham has partnerships across multiple states, UP government, other governments, all of that. So with the Bihar one, the question about what enabled you to stick around and what's happening right now, too, in a way linked, because right now also, like I said, the phase was when we were doing the fieldwork last year. The phase was that the chief minister, who had endorsed the program and had put money and all behind it, had withdrawn because his priority, political elections had come up, his priority had changed. And, you know, the classic challenge that we see politicians withdrawing because they did not have that long-term political commitment. It was just an opportunity that they availed at a particular time. So the argument I'm trying to make is that in this time, and this is currently what is happening, is that Pratham is not withdrawing from the state. Because do you understand, a normal NGO normally would say, okay, fine, 6 months, 7 months, our funds are exhausted, and if the state is not coming back, we will quit. You know, quit out of that state, move somewhere else. Normally, that's what happens. Or maximum a year, you can keep your staff being paid. Pratham model, on the other hand, is a very community-driven model. So basically, and when I say community-driven, it's a model where most of the teachers come because when they work with the state, to clarify, they were training the government teachers to use this method. But otherwise, they basically recruit volunteers, community members who they train, and they provide this education, and they're paid very little. There are different motivations for which they do it. Actually, there's a follow-up Rice paper. It should be on the website in the next 2 months, which is giving you a lot of detail of Pratham extensive community mobilization work. Because after finishing the first paper, it came out that it's the community mobilization stuff that really makes it so sustainable and effective. So there's a whole paper in which I try to highlight what are the aspects of it. So one is they draw a lot on the volunteers. Secondly, the thing is that their community engagement, they mobilize the whole village or the community in some way for different kind, for education data gathering, because Pratham does a lot of ASAR. I don't know how many of you are familiar, a lot of education data primary gathering work to influence policy. So that's all done through community mobilization work too. They're doing a lot of new models where they're trying to engage grandmothers and all to supervise school, this evening schools where children learn from each other. So do you understand? So it's all community driven, all of this work, and in which they incentivize not through money but through other means. So even in Bihar right now, government withdrew. They cannot train government teachers. The budget that the government had made available is gone, but all of this other work is happening, and the state and the bureaucrats are seeing it. So do you understand? So whenever the politician is ready to come back to them, because they still have visibility, they are there and they're ready and they're waiting, and they of course lobbying the government too, that we came this far, let's go back. Do you understand? So that's what current phase is, and that's what sticking around means. But for that you have to be very community embedded, which sadly, because I do a lot of work on aid and NGOs in development as well, most NGOs in developing countries are not that too donor driven, right? All reliant. So that is Pratham's strength, to be community embedded. And the external one, I think that is slight misunderstanding. The way I presented, maybe somebody the second point raised in the middle about why is Pratham still external. It's not external, but I never tried to say that it was external to anything. But I think the argument one was making is that it's not a given that the governments have adopted it for a long time. Do you understand? Because I think the question seemed to assume as if Pratham has been working with government has adopted this model forever. No, that's not the case. In some states, there's not even a partnership. While in Bihar, yes, there is a long-term partnership where the government agreed and very enthusiastically took it on at one point. But I've tried to show you that even in that there have been challenges. So I think that's a more an issue of clarification that it has never been so government owned that we say that it's already with the government. So that way it's still an external innovation by an NGO.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. And previous comment about sort of the relationship between the government and the community is a great segue to a question we have for you, Hiba. Ian wanted to know how the relationship between the government and the CBOs involved has been managed. Have there been any tensions in scaling all on SimSim through working with the Ministry of Education and engaging community-based organizations, and how has that relationship been managed?
So just to clarify, that all of the Ministry of Education's program were implemented through the public schools that belong to the Ministry of Education. We have tried piloting, and we still are piloting the school readiness program in CBOs, especially in the south of Jordan, where there's less access to services like education and less KG2 classrooms. In terms of the relationship between the ministry and the CBOs, so what we're trying to do now is to push for the formalization of implementing ECE and CBOs. So the Ministry of Education takes a monitoring and supervisory role over this implementation within CBOs. The most recent discussions is the ministry is interested in this approach because the ministry, even though there is universal KG2 in Jordan, there is a lack of KG2 classrooms. There are not enough classrooms for all children. So they are considering this approach. keeping in mind, and this is back to the point that I think Jonathan mentioned of the high turnover and then the shifts in priorities and decision making. The old Secretary General was completely against the CBO implementation, but the new Secretary General is shifting more towards kind of exploring the potential for implementing in CBOs. So I think the short answer to that is that the relationship between the ministries and CBOs depends on who's managing that relationship in the ministry and what their perception of CBO's implementation is. I will say just one last point on this point, and I think, Jenny, we talked about this a lot, about the status of CBOs in Jordan. Growing up, I used to go to CBOs to, join these community programs, religious studies classes, and it was owned and driven and financed by the community, parents from the community. And then I think around 15 years ago, there was a flood of INGOs and foreign funding to Jordan after the Iraqi crisis and then the Syrian crisis. And then what we see now when we are assessing CBOs is a graveyard of INGO work and a reliance, a dependency of CBOs on this foreign funding and an ability to stand again on their feet, to be led by the community and to respond to community needs. So throughout this pilot, this has been the main challenge, is that the CBOs have also grown comfortable with this model of implementation, easy funding, easy money, just implement the model as is, and some lack of motivation to find their own streams of income generation, to respond to the community needs, to develop activities and intervention for children and community members. So I think this would be moving forward as we pilot further and explore this formalization with the ministry. I think the sustainability of the financing and the way CBOs perceive themselves as part of the community, I think this would be the main challenge for us moving forward.
Great. Thanks for that, Hiba. It makes me think, how challenging it is. We talk about shifting systems and yet some of the inadvertent, unintended consequences of where the system has been changed. One quick question for you, Molly. I know there's been a lot of talk about the evolving role of the originating sort of entity or organization when it is a non-state actor. And in fact, I feel like what everyone has spoken to is it's an ongoing evolution. It's not necessarily a sort of discrete moment in time handover. Could you talk at all about any sort of insights, lessons for some of the cases that you've been looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is maybe sort of, if we think about the tool we shared as well, this is sort of using the tool as a way to also identify what are things that have been more transferred to the government, which roles or elements, and which elements is the originating institution clearly still leading on because institutionalization is low. And that might be a way also to sort of parse out where things stand, and maybe there wants to be an emphasis on transitioning those roles, or it's not ready yet. I think in some of the case studies we've looked at, a few of the areas that seem to be places where the originating organization still has a strong role, and I think Jonathan touched this as well, including things like supporting on data collection and quality control, advocacy, certainly in fundraising, evaluation, and documentation, coordination, and continuing to provide training, and then of course this piece of building capacity for implementation and institutionalization and then the handover.
Great, thank you for that. Well, I know we only have 6 minutes left and a quick second part to the agenda. So maybe I'll just quickly turn it over to you, Gael, if you have any concluding comments, and to thank the panelists.
Thank you so much. I think this was a great conversation, and I think it's one that we're going to continue having for a long time. But I really do want to thank all the panelists and Jenny as well for moderating this the Q&A session. Thank you to all the participants for your great comments and questions. The chat was quite active, so we'll go through that, see if there's anything else we could answer. We will put the links, documents. We have some documents from Halam Simsim. We have the links to Masuda's study, the links to the tracker, and Jonathan will be doing a larger presentation on this very topic next week. So we'll be happy to share that information on the website. Again, thank you very much to everybody.
But don't leave yet. Sorry,
Yes.
5 minutes. Probably didn't make that very clear. Just very, very quickly, you know, one of the things I should have said at the beginning when we talked about the previous webinars, yes, the slides can absolutely be shared, is that these sessions are meant to be very demand driven by the community of practice, right? It's not necessarily what Gael and I think are interesting, but it's really hearing from you all in terms of what are the issues that you all would like to hear about, discuss, share. So with that, I just want to take a moment now, Natalie, if you don't mind putting out just 2 more quick surveys. We just want to get a sense from you all some of the topics that you'd be interested in discussing in the year ahead. We didn't want to start with a blank slate for fear of crickets, no, but we just thought, just for efficiency, we thought we would share a list of some of what has come up in past education working group conversations, as well as just across the community of practice. So if you just take a moment, select up to 3 of those that are listed, but please do not feel limited by those. There's an other category, check that, and then write any and all ideas in the chat box. Again, this could be the potential focus of potential events in the year ahead. And I know some of these topics, you know, can be interpreted in many different ways. Don't be shy with the other category either. Not surprisingly, a lot around cost and financing, right? Everything from collection, analysis, use, you know, how we think about it in terms of comparing to the existing, you know, national government budgets, long-term financing, role of external funders, as we started talking about, intermediary organizations, you know, those third parties that can play a role in facilitating the scaling process, rather perhaps around some of those roles that Molly spoke to, monitoring and evaluation, research development, capacity strengthening. Yeah, great. Thanks, Christine. Very timely with today's conversation about how local orgs can support government in the long term. Measuring, great, Heather. Great. Okay, some great ideas and just the beginning, but really appreciate that. The next and final poll is just a little bit on any thoughts on how we might discuss these topics. It goes without saying that 2 years into this, I think we all are really tired of talking to each other and hearing from each other across a computer screen. And so really just welcome ideas of, you know, what would make this kind of virtual exchange in the near future most engaging, and what are you most interested in hearing about? You know, for example, is it some frameworks around some of these topics and terminology and some, you know, the conceptual ideas behind them? Is it more of the sort of case studies that bring to life some of these principles and concepts? Is it more opportunity to exchange across sectors? As I mentioned, we have this amazing opportunity with the community of practice of 9 different education working groups. Is it the sort of concrete guidance and tools along the lines of what Molly was sharing? Or is it frankly not to choreograph it so much and just have a space to come together and have an open conversation or some time for that? And then, of course, other ideas. Great. Well, with the last minute, please continue to vote. We can keep the poll open for a moment, but I just wanted to just quickly wrap up to take a moment to introduce our new co-chair of the Education Working Group. Gael and I are incredibly pleased to introduce a new co-chair. After a fantastic 3 years as co-chair of this group, I will be passing the baton, stepping down, and delighted that Heather Simpson has agreed to join us as a co-chair. I'm sure for many of you, Heather is no stranger. She's been an active member of the working group since the start. Heather is the Chief Program Officer of Room to Read, where she's responsible for the design, execution, and monitoring of Room to Read's literacy and girls education program in 16 countries across Asia and Africa. Heather has more than 20 years of experience in international development, including previous to Room to Read with Save the Children. And, you know, for those of you that know Heather, you know she not only brings a wealth of experience and deep knowledge in education and scaling, but a real passion and commitment to children's learning. So I can't think of a better person to help facilitate this group alongside Gael, and just want to welcome you, Heather, to the group, to chairing the group.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you. I have big shoes to fill, Jenny. I've really appreciated your leadership on this. And Gael and I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to more closely work with Gael. Gael and I used to work together at the American Institutes for Research as well. So I just love this opportunity. And as I've mentioned, the Scaling Up community of practice is my favorite community of practice, and I always learn a lot through this interaction, and I am just thrilled to have this opportunity to continue engaging in new and different ways.
Wonderful. Well, welcome. Great to have the dynamic duo back together. Just to wrap up and say a big thanks to all of you who presented today. Jonathan, Hiba, Masuda, Molly, thank you so much. Gael, thanks for leading this session. And a huge thanks to the entire MSI team for supporting this and all the other events the past 2 weeks. Natalie, Sean, and Rita, thank you so much. And I hope you'll be able to participate in the remaining 3 sessions. We have the M&E session tomorrow morning, Friday. We have the social, 9 a.m., I shouldn't say, Eastern time. It might not be morning for many of you. The social enterprise innovation, Monday, 9 a.m. Eastern time. And then our final plenary Tuesday at 9 a.m. Eastern time to discuss some scaling principles and the future direction for the community of practice. So thank you all so much. And yeah, we will be in touch.
Thank you, everyone.